What if? Let go of the present conditions. Allow wild imaginings. Let details come into view. You are happy here. How does that feel in your body? How does the air in this imagined place feel on your skin? What time of day is it? Is it bright or is it dark? Are you inside or outside? If you can, wiggle your toes. What's beneath your feet? Are you somewhere you have never been before? Are you in a field, a forest, or are you in a building? Is there anyone there with you? Who or what are they?
In environmental advocacy work, it's easy to get bogged down by the most urgent problems, the issue facing us right now, the thing that's right in front of us. Rarely do many of us take the time to ask what the world we want to live in looks like. We don't often make space for imagination and confronting climate change, and rarely think of the work of imagining a better environment as fun. But art allows us a space for reconnecting with not just where we live, but how we live, opening us up to whole new possibilities for life on Earth and, through games, the opportunity to have fun while doing this. Today we're talking about environmental art, and with two artists who have developed a new game that helps us reimagine how we live with our environment. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. So today we're speaking with two artists, Sarah Rothberg and Marina Zurkow, who work across a range of media but are deeply interested in questions around what art and games can do to unlock our imagination and understanding of environmental issues. I'm also joined by Dr. Joe Campana, the director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies, a scholar and poet who's helped to bring in a variety of projects that Marina and Sarah have worked on in Houston over the last decade. Sarah, Marina, and Joe, welcome so much to the program.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So just to start off a little bit here, Marina and Sarah, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourselves and your work a little bit, especially concerning how you first started thinking around environmental issues and the role that your art plays in this work.
I'm going to just recount this from my personal experience, and then you can do the same. I've been working in the environmental art space since around 2005, and Sarah and I were working in 2014, 15, 16 on a big logistics project, trying to understand logistics, the invisible force that moves goods around the planet that nobody really thinks about when they hit the Buy It Now button, and that there's really no kind of visualization of for people to find some material connection to how it works or why one should care. And it's such an intrinsic environmental problem that it seemed important to put a face on it, so to speak. So we worked on this with another artist who's a data journalist and artist named Surya Matu. And one summer in 2014, 2015, we had a residency through the Manhattan Cultural Council, LMCC, in Governor's Island, which is very well positioned to see the harbor. And we were studying logistics hardcore. We were reading Deb Cowan, The Deadly Life of Logistics. We were reading we took a course called
Globalization. I think it was
called Globalization in the Little Self or something. And it was a fantastic online free class by Matthew Spark, who's a Marxist critic of neoliberalism. And we kind of got to the end of this residency. We were making big maps of the world, renaming the world, getting rid of nations, thinking of nations through their fluctuations of goods rather than through their, flag identities and so on. And Sarah made a little drawing that she pinned to the corner of the map of this fantasy space. It was a little bit like Lord of the Rings in itself.
It was sort of like if a child were to draw a globe and none of the continents resembled the ones that we have now.
So it's a long story, but it was a kind of amazing moment where we thought, okay, we can critique this until we're dead, and nothing is going to change for anybody. And it was literally a cut the cord moment that we had of thinking we need to create something that is generative to think about different kinds of futures and different kinds of connections and different kinds of worlds and world building than we had been working in. I'm going to pass this to you.
That was very thorough, I think. I guess the thing to add to this is that, Marina had been also working on thinking about the ocean as like a surface for transportation and understanding how it creates, I think this was your phrase, like a Pangea of capital. And again, this was back in thinking of how can we sort of depict this and how will that make people feel differently about commodities. But at that time, specifically, I remember I had been making media art. I don't really come from environmental background the same way that Marina does, but I was really interested in practicing how you can bring an audience into feeling more involved. Specifically, I'd been working on a lot of like virtual reality and with game engines. And I think somewhere in between the kind of systems thinking that Marina's done for a long time and that we were doing with these globalization classes and readings and logistics, we sort of landed on, well, what if we could make these systems feel very personal by asking people to participate in the creation of alternative worlds? Which at that time, 2014 or 2016, pre-Trump, was like, oh, yes, there really does feel like there is no alternative a lot of the time. So now we look back at that moment and we think it's funny because how many times has the world completely changed since then? And I think that's one of the things that's been interesting that led this sort of system that we've developed, this more and more futures evolve over time.
It's interesting that you don't immediately categorize yourself as an environmental artist, Sarah. When and looking back on some of your past projects, and I'm thinking of like Water Without Wet and Touching a Cactus, even just an exploration of your childhood home. Place is so, and you're thinking about it from this kind of virtual reality space, but place and the kind of environments we're in and the way that we encounter the world, especially through the virtual, what we can do that's impossible that we can make possible in the virtual, seems to really run across your portfolio for quite a while.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I guess I would just say that because I have so much respect for artists like Marina and people like Joe who are really working with scientists and thinking about ecosystems in really deep ways, where I think my approach has a lot more to do with media and systems and place, I think, is definitely the kind of point of contact between those
Absolutely.
two things.
Yeah.
I think there's also something really important, which is many people, whether they're writers, scholars, some of our students, artists, well, I'm not really an environmental artist, I'm something else, but you can't encounter so many issues without colliding with what it means to think about ecologies and to think about our embeddedness in the planet that's having some trouble right now, thanks to us, right? So there's a way that in some important ways, everybody is working on environment and thinking about it, even if it doesn't look like it.
And that attention to place, I was actually, I completely agree, Joe. But also, I think it directly translates to a lot of the work that you do, Marina. And you do a huge range of, animal projects, of things really focused on climate change. I don't know if you want to talk about your project Breath Eaters at all, and really this visualization that seems to run across, but also the way that we encounter place in Whale Fall Feast, a piece of yours that you did a couple of years ago that I love. That's very much about making place and thinking through these ideas in really in-depth ways. That I promise we will get to your collaboration in just a minute, but I want to highlight some of the exceptional projects that you've done on your own first, and just how you think through, this idea of how we think through and imagine the environment across a range of media and ways of engagement.
It's funny. I think similar to Sarah, I'm really interested in producing affect. So differently from Sarah, often my means of getting there are research in the scientific, natural, ecological sciences, relational material scholarship around environmental studies, blue humanities, and so on. Not to say that you don't do research. I certainly was not imputing that. It's different.
I'm not offended.
Research. And where we collide is in the sort of systemic, overlapped, fungible boundaries around systems and thinking through how change, and Donella Meadows in particular, this idea of leverage points to intervene in a system.
Can you say more about that?
So she was a very important systems thinker who passed away, I think, in the early 90s and had done everything from – she wrote a book called Limits to Growth that no one wanted to read in the late 70s about capitalism's fantasy that they can grow endlessly and that unfortunately dovetails with a myth that there's endless materials that you can grow this endless growth upon. And now, of course, as much of that has changed into data mining and humans as sort of not only biopower but kind of material resources, they're still managing to perpetuate that. And she also wrote a lot about the relationship specifically between systems thinking and ecological realities. And so one of her fantastic devices that she invented was the iceberg model, which is an analytic tool to look at any world of any sort of systems and conditions through the lens of an iceberg. So you have the very tip top, which is the events you can see, and then one layer down is the patterns and behaviors that support that event, and the next level down is the systems and the institutional structures that support those patterns of behavior, and at the very bottom is the ideological backbone that supports this entire iceberg. It's very hard to get to the bottom. And so because of that tool, then she ended up writing a long, very complicated essay called 11 leverage points to intervene in a system. So if you imagine a system as a closed circle, which of course is not a fixed circle, you can puncture holes in the edge of that boundary. And there are different scales at which you can do that and different levels of efficacy that you can do that. For instance, you can intervene in a small community kind of political structure. There are ways to create wedges. And that's what art does really well. I'm going to get back to this. I think art is a really interesting wedge that can operate at a tiny, tiny level or can operate at a very big level or can model different kinds of systemic approaches to the world. In the case of Mary Mattingly's work, I think she's a great example of somebody who's...
You're going to have to define these things. We're a broad audience.
Mary Mattingly?
Yes.
So she's another environmental artist of some... she's a tremendous environmental artist who's done everything from create food forests on barges that have kind of funged the laws in New York City around creating edible forests by putting them on a barge.
That seems like a far more useful use of a barge than whatever Pete Davidson and Colin Joe spot. So, yeah.
She's done some interesting other ways of using art as the exception in order to challenge rules that if you said I'm a food forest, you would never get to do that. But if you say I'm an art project, you do. And so that becomes a model of a different way of being. So I always really admired that. You wanted me to talk about Breath Eater. Oh, well, all right, so I did a project called The Breath Eaters, and it's the most, in a way, square, full-on data visualization project I've done. I work with a really brilliant technologist collaborator named James Schmitz, and we created a globe that is looking at three things: high winds and high wind patterns in real time from National Oceanographic Administration, occurrence of fire around the planet, so anything above a certain heat threshold, and the outputs of fossil fuel and biomass factories. So in other words, generation plants. So not factories that use it, but that actually produce energy. And there's data for all of these things. And the globe isn't named, is not divided by nation. What you're looking at is how what's called PM 2.5, black particulate matter, which is
Okay.
produced by fires or produced by fossil fuel generation plants. These are black particles, carbon, are taken up into the high atmosphere through lower atmosphere winds, but eventually pushed around the planet, and are shared burdens by any nation that is subject to experiencing wind. And these things often will dissolve in rains into the ocean. So we just wanted to produce an affectful data visualization of what it means to produce this much black particulate matter and what it means to have it moved around the planet through the winds. So it's a very very straightforward piece, but it has a lot of emotional impact when you see and experience this as a visualization.
You know, it's interesting. As you're talking, I realize something that I've always admired about a lot of art, but about yours particularly, is this pivot between analytical and generative. We often separate those out. The arts are over here, scholarship or research over here, or sometimes lately and unhelpfully, they're all smashed together, or they're the same thing, which also isn't true. But when I think about the first show of yours that I saw, Necrocracy, here at Diverse Works, when Diverse Works was up by the UH downtown campus, we walked in and I saw two things before I went into the main gallery. One was hazmat suits for kids. Which, yes, you kind of laugh a little bit when you think about it. And there are these, almost cute little suits. And then you sort of pause and you think, oh, my God, right? You think this is the sort of the intensity of a potential future. And on the outside, too, there were a couple other things. But one was, if I'm remembering the name right, is it Neo Geo? The kind of these visualizations of sort of essentially drills kind of going through subsurface. But they were so gorgeous. And I thought, oh, right, wow, because we sometimes find destructive process appealing, and we sometimes find it hypnotic in a certain way. So there's that great way that I've always found with your work, and it's definitely true of the system that you and Sarah have built and other sort of works that you've done. I was saying earlier as we were walking over here, I always do an exercise based on work that Sarah and Marina did around waste and plastics. It's sort of work of mindfulness and it's analytic work, but then it's also pivots to the generative in a way that I find so appealing. And
Do you want to share what that is?
Oh, which one?
The waste piece.
Oh, the waste piece. So so every year in Environmental Studies 100, I ask my students to create an exercise based on work that Sarah and Marina did at an arts fair in Brooklyn, where they measured the plastic that people would come up and they would measure how much plastic they had. I have these fantastic photos of it. I wasn't there, but you had uniforms. You were measuring the plastic, and people would get an equivalent. Correct me if I get this wrong. Equivalent in pellets, in plastic pellets of the plastic that they kind of didn't know was on their body because all of our devices are mostly plastic.
We had people, they were emptying their handbags into a bin, and then we had a balancing scale, one of those children's scales.
Yeah.
And so on one side of the scale was all their possessions in the bin, and on the other side of the scale was the equivalent in nurdles, plastic nurdles. So then we gave them all the nurdles in addition to all their plastic back, which nobody wanted.
And there's been a lot more work on plastic since that moment. There wasn't as much, so it felt really revelatory. And what I loved about it too, and one of the exercises is for the students to understand how much plastic they have on their bodies as they're carrying them around, but also to carry their own plastic waste for a few days, which is something that Marina was also doing at that time. I like these exercises, these ways of thinking, because it's about mindfulness, but it's not about shame. It's not about, oh, look, you've got plastic on you, like everyone else, right? It's about mindfulness and a kind of actual deep generosity that then allows for creativity and sort of to generate something else, some other way of thinking, because you've understood something without feeling lectured at or ashamed or, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, because you've had an intimate encounter with a material.
Yeah,
it's been important.
None of the paralyzing affects. It's a set of generative affects that let you think differently. Cutting the cord, which is a phrase you both use all the time, right, with the more and more future system. And I think that's part of, you have to be able to pivot from really understanding, being mindful, but then being able to act and not being paralyzed. And I love that about the work that you both do.
Well, and maybe that's a good place to pivot to the more and more future system, as Joe just laid it out for us. So the two of you have been working on this system and have done a series of iterations of kind of decks of this system you've built out. So you've got a new one coming out, which is why we invited you on. And so I'd love to hear about what is investing in futures, what is the system that you've built, and walk us through a little bit of this collaboration.
Well, we've recently changed the name to More and More Futures because but we're having trouble with the transition ourselves as well. It's funny. I'm actually just kind of lost in thought because I hadn't thought about that plastics collaboration, which was mine and Marina's very first collaboration
Oh, wow.
ever. And I'm thinking about what it has in common with this deck, which is it's not just about interacting with the plastic. It's also about the conversation between us and it's not like here's a form, measure your plastic, put it in this. It's like we are going to walk you through this process. We're going to talk to you about it. We're going to have this conversation around oh, did you know that your lipstick probably has these petrochemicals in it and what so I don't know, that sort of relates to this idea of this more and more future system, which isn't just about doing something on your own or imagining a future, but so much of it is about conversing with a group to imagine together. And I think in that way, it's in a weird way, it's kind of similar. I don't know if you'd agree, but so should I explain what it is?
Please,
Is that
yes.
I see I've been called upon to give an explanation. So essentially, the way that More and More Futures works is typically it's a workshop. It's centered around a deck of cards that are split into categories that might be used to describe a world that might be impossible or improbable or maybe possible, but said in such a way that's a bit disorienting. So the categories are things like government, economic system, shared values. A group of 4 or several groups of 4 will choose a card from a different category as the starting point for a world that then they have to co-imagine. And the trick is, and this took years of iteration, is it has to be a world you want to live in. So when we didn't say that, oftentimes people would jump straight into making these dystopian futures or these dystopian worlds. And then, we also didn't want people to make utopias because those actually don't challenge you to think about your own values or connect to those. So the groups start with this starting point, which is very generative. So they're not just imagining from a blank page. They build this world together through conversation and then eventually choose roles within those worlds. So that might be like architect or pet or parent or time traveler from the past, and then really try to move from the systems perspective into the first person to inhabit that world by making something together. And then sharing with the other worlds and reflecting, which is the last part that we've really been trying to refine recently. How do you look at these worlds that you imagine based on your shared values in your group, and then ask what can you think about through that in terms of the present. So we've just recently made this energy deck, thanks to the invitation of Joe. I don't know, Marina, do you want to expand with that?
That was great.
Oh, I'll say just very quickly. So I remember it was the moment that the deck was coming together. I think this history is kind of great. And it started, if I remember right, the first box was a Kickstarter campaign. And I remember getting the box and being so excited and thinking, this is just fabulous. And then I thought, on the one hand, you think, wow, only so many of these got around the world. I feel so lucky to have one. And then you think, oh, I want more people to have them. So we started a conversation. It was this kind of terrifying, awful moment of the pandemic, and I think we were all trying to figure out what world were we living in? What was the world now? We started chatting a bit about potentially putting this online. I love the artifactuality of a card deck. I love the feeling the cards and flipping them and being with people. But I also thought lots more people could get access to this if it were online. Is there a way to do that also doesn't, ruin it, basically? And we started talking about that. And I remember, too, it was just after the murder of George Floyd. And some of your students, as I recall, were using the system to try to think about this moment and what would it be to think about being beyond policing. And one summer there were these incredible workshops, and they were so generous to let me just sort of peek in on one of them as we were talking about the potential for putting the system online. And these unbelievable conversations were happening. And I thought, this is absolutely, the thing to do. So we worked on essentially sorry, Marina worked on the website, but the center wanted to support that. And in exchange, we got to have our own deck made, too, which is a waste deck, which is fantastic. And when you sort of flip those cards, talk about having to really think about the world that you live in and the world that you want to live in. And then it sort of just grew from there.
Yeah, a couple of comments. I think it can sound enigmatic. We're not making a utopia, but we want to make a world you want to live in.
Yeah.
So we have created a suite of really complicated cards, and they resist any kind of homogenizing of a world into a perfect sort of textureless field. And people struggle with this because they're weird. You might get the government is cats, and your living conditions are that all children live separately from adults. So these are not necessarily comfortable. And then there's some delightful ones, like all information is disseminated by blimps and skywriting, or money expires in one day. That one will really freak people out. So they encourage you to negotiate with your fellow team players to find pleasure in these sort of discomforting but not intrinsically valenced conditions. That's really where the world you want to live in comes in, I think.
There's something
Does that make sense?
Yes, and there's something so important about it because it also forces us to not pretend that the world we do live in is not like that, right? This is also, and that comes from the part of this is also that analytic piece. It makes us more mindful of the fact we actually do live in a world in which we have to try to make it a world we want to live in when we're faced by circumstances we don't control, things that are kind of aversive or difficult, and also to realize, and this seems to be such an important part, the conditions we live in are not the only ones that could have arisen. Therefore, they can change, right, which is a powerful part of the system. But also, let's not treat everything that's the norm as the norm because it became that way.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we are constantly being retold that this leads to the future and that there's no other trajectories possible. This is since the 80s we've been told that this is an irrefutable trajectory. That's the core of sort of neoliberal messaging and driving that further and further into atomized individuals. And I don't want to sound like I'm on a stump about this with political rhetoric, but would you say that that's something that we're interested in challenging?
I like how you said, I don't want to say that, so you just threw it.
So you do it.
Please do it.
So would you mind doing the dirty work of, I mean, I think that
Cleaning up my terrible rhetoric, yes.
I think that the sort of most powerful thing that this does is, I mean, it depends on what kind of group is playing it, but I've noticed, especially when we play it with students, just this idea that to reframe the present in such a way where you understand that it's a product of, values and a reflection of decision making and things that you can intervene in and that you do have agency over.
It's kind of a liberatory practice of connecting to your agency. I teach a long-form version of this that's 7-week class or 14-week class in which we do 3 rounds of gameplay. One is 1 week long, one is 2 weeks long, one is 3 weeks long. And each of those gameplays has sort of higher stakes. So the third one is you have to devise a holiday, which can often encapsulate what the iceberg model tries to represent very well. And also you have to devise a problem that you address in this world. And that's something that's an emergent thing that people have to work together to resolve or to understand how the nature of problems and solutions works, which is you often just create more problems or create wicked problems that don't have any kind of solutionism available. And the thing that students have to write a reflection at the end of this, and often they start with, oh, my God, does this mean I have to think about everything all the time now? I was like, well, yeah, in a way, isn't that the pleasure of life is that you sort of see, you get X-ray specs to see systems, and you also get superpower tools to understand that systems are fungible, not entirely, but a little bit. And you get to see that fringe groups can exist and resistance groups have power and all of the things that have to come up in play, which is really cool.
I mean, it sounds, yes, the kind of liberatory practice you're talking about, the kind of empowering of students that it sounds like they're discovering along this process is exciting. And I'm curious if that's part of why the turn to gameplay. What does gameplay bring into this space, and how does playing help us grapple with, you were just talking about wicked problems, right? And we talk about environmental issues and climate change. How does playing a game help us to work through this? And I think you've articulated some of that, but I'm really excited by this intervention that you're making. And so I'd love to hear more on that, in this space in particular, what's the value there?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is the idea of involvement. Imagination is such an active gesture. You're not just receiving information, so you're already activated. You're already seeing yourself as someone with agency. When you're put into a group of people and you're saying, well, actually, like, I don't think that I would like it if the government was cats. Maybe we need to reinterpret cats to mean something else. Like, you really have to connect and also, to some level, like, negotiate, which means explain yourself a little bit. So it's a bit of like a microcosm, right? But because the worlds aren't these realistic worlds, it's also very freeing. You might be able to talk about something in terms of this imagined reality in a way that is an analog to something from the present, but doesn't have the same weight or the same stakes. And, even in that sense, when we've used it with, not in classroom settings, but with adults who are actually sort of contending with different kinds of issues in their groups, it's liberatory in that way. It's freeing to say, okay, well, in this cat's world, if we need to, vote based on like amount of nap time, like how would you vote? How would you vote? Oh, well, I like to sleep this many hours a day or whatever. And so you can sort of get somewhere you might not get. And then that's where this reflection moment at the end, where it was like, oh, this was all playful and fun. And we had this kind of like strange metaphor that we co-created. What from that world do we now actually say, well, this actually was embedded with some of the values of what I want to bring to the present. So it's almost like a little bit of a trick. Like the play is like a little bit of a trick, but because it's so active, it opens something up, I think, in players' brains. At least through my observation, that's what we've sort of witnessed multiple times.
Well, I want to dig in a little bit into some of how this not just works, but like some of the other prompts. Because yes, government by cats is fun, and I understand why we gravitate towards it.
It's funny because that's actually our least favorite prompt, but somehow the easiest one to remember.
But I want to throw out some others. But first, actually, I want just for our listeners, since you've already highlighted, this is an online open access tool that folks can use. They can go to moreandmore.world and access any of these various decks that you've made, from the original to Energy that just came out, Ecospheric Cosmologies, Waste, and What If, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think, as well. But yeah, I mean, I think, to the prompt of there are other conditions we can think of, right? I just pulled a few up from the original deck, but living condition is tree houses, which really, on one hand challenges, but also makes us think of historic methods of living in different ways that people have lived in different societies across time. Food availability, food reflects real cost. We've just done a series of pieces on the show about food cost and the realities of meat production in particular. Economic system, all income is disposable. These are really, interesting things to dig into and to start to grapple with, because it does force us to shift those thoughts. Joe, I think you had wanted to join in before I cut you off.
Well, no, I was going to talk about government by cats, but maybe we shouldn't do that.
No, let's move on.
Let's move on.
So yeah, I don't know if you want to say more on with the kind of conversations that might come out of this, but I'm looking at these. I will say from the Energy deck, and one of the places I definitely want to go is why you've chosen some of these topics, and of course Energy in particular. But I will say I was part of a test group a couple of weeks back, and we were doing a kind of quick version of the game, and one of the prompts was tranquility as a social value, and it has just like gnawed its way into my mind in this way that I cannot let go of the idea of how undervalued tranquility is, and how if we start to actually make that an ideal, how much it would just shift, my my 50-hour work week, right? Like, I mean, it really forces us to grapple with the condition of how we imagine ourselves in the world, not just the world itself, but how we're involving ourselves in broader connections. So if there are particular, things you want to drop and talk through on some of these prompts, or if we want to move into why energy, why these different conversations that you've been hosting.
Well, staying on this tranquility gnawing on you,
Please,
which
yes.
is also a great metaphor of this tranquil rodent just gnawing on your hyperactive, energized self in the energy deck. One of the things that we for the energy deck was a cohort of many awesome people. There was a core group that Joe and Casey Williams really were
Lecturer here at Rice.
spearheaded. I'm now conscious of every single metaphor that's going to come out of my mouth.
Excellent.
Catalyzed this group of people. Shall we name them all?
I have their names.
Great. Let's name them all.
Casey Williams, who was one of the lead people with us, who was so fantastic. Simony Howe, Dominic Boyer, Jordan Kinder, Tara Rowe, Reese Williams, Brent Bellamy, and we also had some extra consultants from other kinds of spaces, Lauren Jabush, Cy X, Karen Pincus, and Liz Chatterjee. We're an amazing group of people to talk to.
And I'll just say really quick, since those names are probably not going to resonate to the majority of listeners, this is a group of anthropologists, of humanists, of scientists, of folks in different spaces working across a range of different thought. And so these are experts in their fields, but are also, I think what's dynamic about that group that you've been working with is they really represent a wide array of disciplines and thought and imaginative spaces to understand what energy means in different contexts.
Yeah, and in a way, the group was the interdisciplinarity, especially of the group, sort of reflects the kind of interdisciplinary conversations that we would like people to be able to have. So sometimes two people that we would talk to might be talking about something which is maybe materially the same thing, but in absolutely different language from each other, which was kind of incredible to witness, especially as someone who, energy is definitely not my area of expertise. And I learned so much from just hearing the different ways people were speaking about these issues.
Yeah, so we developed a kind of a methodology, a pretty simple methodology to have conversation, catch those conversations, give people small bits of homework to come and sort of enumerate their ideas in sentence forms. And then Sarah and my role is as translators. So we, in 7 years of working on this, have a certain amount of aptitude at making cards weird, funny, simple, somewhat understandable. A little bit of research is fine, but it can't be overwhelmingly technical. Everything can't be opaque, black box that you have to dig around on Google to find out anything about.
Yeah.
A few of those. So understanding the percentages of things. And then we have a little bit of a guide, a theme development guide that talks about where you can dig for resources. And so those are in tranquility, for instance, is a mental model as opposed to I'm hyped up, I'm stoked, I'm pumped up. Like all of the metaphors that we have around energy are so intensely hyperactive, leaned forward, supported by energy drinks, caffeinated culture, productivity, 24/7, et cetera.
Yeah.
So the tranquility and these other mental models was a really key piece of this. But so we talk in the theme development guide about, we have a little sort of grid of opportunities, and those are adjacent presents that are unacknowledged, forgotten pasts, known pasts, near futures, far futures, improbable, implausible, and absurd things. That sort of basically covers the suite of things that you then have to figure out. Well, how do you pepper this? How do you create a stew out of those kinds of considerations of world building? So you want to add anything to that? It's a little bit of a nutty description.
I think, too, there's something that one of our consultants talked about, Karen Pincus, who's a really fantastic writer. She's a professor at Cornell. And she said, well, if one of the things that comes out of using the system, and it hadn't yet come out about yet, so this was a consultation prior to the launch. She said, if all that happens is someone says, well, maybe I'll just drive up to the filling station and it's hydrogen instead of gas, you failed, right? And it was never going to happen, right? Because the system accounts for all of those things. Energy is about how we think. It's our bodies, right? It's also about systems that dwarf us massively and that stretch across the planet. And it's not just about if we can just flip a source, everything will be okay, which is part of which is one very simplistic version of the energy transition.
And yes, one to be very skeptical of, that we can have an energy transition that's ideologically seamless and identical to the present, but just plug in some new inputs. That's where we have a problem.
That's, I think, really valuable because exactly what you're suggesting is just that this is not the best possible world that we're in, right? That if we're going to spend the time to critique the social systems and the political systems and economic systems and everything else that we've built, and we acknowledge, I think most people, regardless of any kind of affiliation, are going to say, yeah, this is probably not the best we can do, or we should hope this is not the best we should be doing, then that prompts us to move exactly, rather than trying to think of a replacement system that simply moves us to, well, this is the same thing, but with X instead. Really, yeah, how do we reimagine the way that we're living within our world and on our world?
But that is really hard, and
yeah.
requires a lot of awakeness. And
but it also requires imagination, which is what's so exciting about the work that you're doing.
yeah, that's why it needs to be fun. It can't be pretend fun that has a really explicit message at the bottom. It needs to be really fun, and then if it moves people, it moves people, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. I think we feel confident and somewhat enthusiastic about the fact that it really has moved a lot of people. So that's exciting. And there's neuroscience to back this up if anybody's interested, actually, on the work of the imagination. And the ability to imagine granularly improves your capacity for empathy, for instance. They've done a lot of studies in that space. There's a lot of imagination studies in neuroscience right now. That is a wonderful backup. It's not like we went right to the sources to find justification through science, but it was pleasing to find that justification.
I'm thinking about what you were saying about Karen Pickus's comment about the gas pump. And I think one of the things, just experientially from working on this deck for the past, few months, is thinking around how thinking about energy myself through these many different kind of valences has affected me. And I'm like, well, even just looking at a gas station and thinking about the relationship between food as an energy source and fuel for a car, and trying to sort of understand energy as like how awake or how asleep you feel, and how intertwined all of those things are. I think if players walk away with just that sense of interconnectedness between these systems and the personal level, now that's maybe the lowest bar of what the system offers, but is actually hugely impactful.
You just made me think, too. To put together actually a number of these things, tranquility, too. Imagine going into a gas station. You walk in, maybe you've just filled up your car or someone else is filling up the car. You've walked in. What's right by the register? Like 5-hour energy, 8-hour energy, like how many kinds of those? Like which you can laugh about because of the names, but they're also for people who are working such insane jobs with no tranquility that they have to try to keep themselves going. So the fuel outside, the culture of like personal energy, which sometimes looks like really privileged wellness and sometimes looks like just being worked to death, right? And all of that stuff, weirdly, in the kind of filling station, in that little architecture, all of these different kinds of energy, which are related to one another, they all intersect.
Well, you also mentioned, lots of people have been affected by the system that you've built and have played at this point, and some of that is a number of colleges who've adopted it for classes, your own classes, Joe's classes, but across the country, a number of different places have taken it on. But also, you just finished a pretty major program with MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, which I believe grew out of this system. I'm wondering if you want to talk some about What If.
So What If, that was actually, it was an incredible challenge just from a design perspective, where this space called the Creativity Lab in the MoMA wanted us to be able to have a drop-in version. So meaning people could walk in and do an unfacilitated experience that would somehow deliver some sort of similar offering to what this 3-hour plus workshop does. And it was exciting. It was in conjunction with an exhibit called Emerging Ecologies, which was all about the built environment and ecological thinking, mostly focusing on several architects from the 70s. And we were so excited. We started by just browsing the exhibition and sort of saying, this would make a great card. This would make a great card. What if buildings turn clockwise throughout the day, or what if they could grow and shrink. And what ended up happening, just because of the constraints of the space, was that we knew we couldn't do the full More and More Futures workshop. So we started to draw one card at a time and see, like, what can we do with just that. And it felt like something was still, we still needed that imagination, that prompt to imagine. And that's where we sort of landed on this audio piece. So eventually, What If sort of sprung out as its own deck, much lighter weight. You draw one card, you listen to this audio.
We played a bit of it at the beginning of the episode, which did just to introduce folks, and can play another clip here.
What if? Choose one what if card, one that speaks to you, one that might describe something about a world you want to live in. To awaken your imagination, let's start with a visualization. Read your card over. Ask yourself, if this card is true, what else might be true? If you're comfortable, close your eyes. Take a deep breath in and a relaxing breath out. Allowing your imagination to flow from the words on the card, begin to picture a place. Let go of the present conditions. Allow wild imaginings. Let details come into view.
Oh, yeah, starring, I have to say, Marina, Zurkow's beautiful, soothing voice. And shout out to the person who made the music, Nyla Hunter, who's an incredible harpist, electronic musician. But anyway, so these were aids to the imagination, really kind of bringing some embodied presence into this imagined world. And we found that actually those two small elements were enough to really kind of bring people pretty fast into an understanding of this idea that the present can be different. If nothing else, that's the main offering from it.
Well, right. So you can pick one card, and then you can say, if this card is true, what else is true? And that alone, when you're guided through some kind of embodied experience, seems to start to piece together a little bit of a world. So the last component in MoMA was a simple worksheet, and it said, here's a QR code, you can listen to the audio, you can pick up this headphone, listen to the audio. If this card is true, what else is true? Draw a picture of what you saw when you were doing this guided audio visualization. And the last piece of it was asking you what you would want to bring back to this world if you could. So if time is not a concept, I'm just looking
You're
at
reading off a
card.
card.
Oh, yeah, we have our cards here. So if you can shrink or grow yourself on demand, or this one was great in the MoMA, all art is meant to be smelled, which was fantastic drawings. So we went through the boxes and boxes and boxes of drawings the other day. The show closed just recently. And the number of drawings where it was like a person with their arm up and someone just standing, like a painting of someone with their arm up and someone standing smelling the armpit.
There were popular cards.
I bet.
We went through at least 15,000 drawings
Wow.
last week, and we didn't even get through all of them because the volume at MoMA is incredible, and the project was up for 5.5 months.
Wow.
And get there, which was incredible because it was the first time I met Sarah in person. We'd been on so many Zooms. And it was when I walked up and Sarah was on the way and I was texting with Marina, so we were coordinating. The studio was full, and then it would empty a little bit, and then it would fill almost immediately. So I feel like I watched it fill and empty like 2 or 3 times as I was exploring some other exhibitions when Sarah was on the way over. And people were so happy and they were so interested and they loved these responses.
It was really surprising. And it was kids and adults.
Yeah.
And it was very surprising to us. We had no idea if this was going to work as a standalone experience, but apparently it engendered a lot of happy focus for people to imagine that their streets are made of moss, or celebrities do not exist, or humans can digest plastic.
Yeah, and one for you, Weston. Nap time is part of the workday. Adds a little more tranquility in.
It would, yes, if only I took naps. I think something there that I really admire, both in how you were thinking around what if, but also in the larger kind of workshop system is, your attention to working backwards. That after you've generated this world, really thinking about those interventionary steps, that if this is what we want or if this is what we're trying to implement, how do we get there? And that I think is also a really interesting component of this is this kind of marriage of that imaginative practice into a more, that direct teamwork you're talking about, but also that the imaginative practice of how do we do it, though, which I think is often neglected in a lot of the work that we do, is not making the space and time for really thinking through. And so I don't know if you want to talk any more about that part of the project or how you think of that as I don't want to get into the efficacy of art kind of conversation, but these aspects that actually allow us, and I think in really interesting ways in your work, to imagine that this is efficacious for, it's not purely in the fantasy realm, but actually this is a very practical element of work backwards now and think about how could this be implemented.
Well, there is a technical term for this called backcasting. That is the opposite of forecasting. Though many people don't know that backcasting is something that actually is a practice, although often implemented in way more practical ways than we're using it. So, for instance, you could work with an organization and say, pie in the sky, who will you be in 50 years? And then the question would be, working backwards, what do you do in terms of taking steps to get from here to that 50-year vision? So really grounded in practical notions of where the world might be in 50 years. So we took that and our process is more extrapolative.
I think we undesigned thinking it.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other podcast, is the opposite of design thinking. But I think also we've really latched on recently to the word reflection. And I know just in my own practice as an educator, like teaching people that reflection is actually the most important part of anything that they do, that after they finish, they wrote something, they made something, they tried to build something, that the part where you actually articulate, wait, what did I learn by doing this, is kind of the piece where you have something that sticks. And so we do this part, which is a bit more like backcasting in the workshop, but it can sometimes be a little bit hard to process in the moment. Well, especially when you're moving from such an absurd world to something that's like, oh, we're bringing you back down to the present. But what feels always kind of effective is asking people to just reflect on the experience. How did it feel to imagine something that you wanted? How did it feel to negotiate with others in the space? And so even if you're not doing that level of like very practical backcasting, it allows you to say, okay, how can I use this type of thinking, this kind of feeling again in other contexts in the real world?
It's interesting. So I've used this in 5 years of environmental studies teaching, and it's not the only venue for this system, but it's one that's been fascinating to think about. And when I introduce it alongside something else, which is the Financial Times created a how do you get to net zero by 2040 simulator. I can't remember exactly the language they use. It's essentially a decision tree with a few random things, and then you hire a consultant that could be a business person or an eco person named Gina Green or whatever. So there's a bit of dressing it up as drama, but it's essentially a decision tree. And I asked the students to talk to me about the two systems and what they experience in them, and then once they've kind of thought through that, which they prefer and why. They always say more and more futures. They respond against the idea that I think they realize in working with it that there are limits to the decision tree model where you're not cutting the cord. You may be forecasting a bit, but you're extrapolating from mostly exactly existing systems. And that can feel more practical, or it could feel more deadly. I mean, honestly, there's a way that it's also very claustrophobic. It's very kind of limiting, and they sort of respond to something that engages them critically. It's a critical imagination, not unicorns and and rainbows, but also not depressive apocalypse. It's a critical imagination. It requires mindfulness and reflection, but it opens the world back up in a way that's really important.
To go back to the Danella Meadows, I feel like you're reading my mind on this same
I
thing.
had something else to say.
One of the we sort of found this after we had been doing this system for a while, but we found this talk that she gives called the Down to Earth talk, I think is how you can find it on YouTube. And she's at a conference on mapping systems on world hunger. And this talk starts by saying, I threw my talk out the night before because I realized as I've been at this conference, I've been asking people, well, what does a world without hunger look like? And nobody was able to answer the question. And that by looking at everything as this like problem to be solved, you kind of limit what is possible in terms of envisioning. So essentially this all brings back this idea, like you have to be able to envision the world that you want to make happen. And you can't do that if you're only looking at it as problems to address.
But because that also objectifies a problem and pushes it away from you, and you stop being sort of interwoven in the middle of an environment. It's the same thing. Like I would have a critique of my own work back in the day of looking at the environment as a siloed issue, not in the way that it's so deeply entangled with economics and social values and sort of spiritual ideologies and the entire gamut of things that we actually have in our project. So you could not have an environment card at all and be talking about the environment, back to Joe's point. So.
No, that's something we come back to every week is the intertwined nature of these thorny problems. So no, that's a great place to end. And thank you so much for sharing and walking us through this. And very excited to play the new energy version of More and More Futures. You can go to moreandmore.world and play any of the existing decks and learn more about Marina and Sarah's wonderful work. Marina Zurkow, Sarah Rothberg, Joe Campana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
you, Weston.
You.
So for this week, I would like to direct your attention for how to get involved towards a volunteer opportunity with the Keep Texas Beautiful initiative. This is for League City in particular. There's a volunteer opportunity, a waterway cleanup at the Nature Center out in League City. It's Saturday, May 11th from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., and anyone can show up to volunteer. Parking is located at the League City Public Boat Ramp at 1500 Egret Bay Boulevard. That's 1500 Egret Bay Boulevard. The cleanup will take place at the Dr. Ned and Faye Downey Clear Creek Nature Center, and it's a section of the park located west of Egret Bay Boulevard. Volunteers will take a short walk over to the cleanup location from the designated parking area. Anyone ages 10 and up can come. They're going to take up to 80 people, so probably a good chance you can join that group. They do have sign up in advance, and they will be having a free Keep League City Beautiful T-shirt for those who attend and volunteer. So this is a great way just to get out and meet some neighbors who are really interested in volunteering and helping to clean up some of the things that we can get our own hands on and making our communities a little bit better. So that's our volunteer opportunity for the week. Up next time, we'll be speaking with Heather Davis, who is a professor who thinks about plastic and the way that plastic impacts our world, so you won't want to miss that. Again, I'd like to plug that if you don't already subscribe to our podcast, please do so. It's available on all major podcast platforms, Gulf Streams, and it's a great way to stay in touch with what's going on in Houston and beyond around the environment. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.